Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about the film The Pianist, which came out in 2002. It was directed by Roman Polanski and written by Ronald Harwood, who also wrote Taking Sides, which we covered recently. It's based on the memoir The Pianist, which was published in 1946, written by Władysław Szpilman. It's Szpilman's harrowing account of surviving the Holocaust in his hometown of Warsaw, Poland. And the film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, as well as 3 Academy Awards. What did you think of this movie?
I had never seen this movie before, which seemed impossible to me when I started watching. I was like, I'm sure I've seen this before. I must have seen this before, but no. This was my first time watching it. I find it really effective and interesting. And the most interesting thing about it is the fact that we follow this man and he has no choice in anything that's happening to him. It's like he's on a boat on a current out at sea, and there's no way for him to get out of this current. It just keeps happening and pulling him in all sorts of direction. And for someone with so little autonomy in what's happening to him, it feels so strangely exciting to watch. It's terrifying and terrible to watch, but also really exciting. And I can't really put my finger on what I'm trying to say exactly, but it's an interesting movie for me. And I have unfortunately not read the memoir, and you have, and you had seen it before, and I have not. So I want to know what you thought of it before you watched it again after reading the memoir, and then what you thought after.
Yeah, so I used to teach history to high school kids, so I used to show bits and pieces of The Pianist. So I had seen it before, and I remember it being a really well-made film. And then I read the memoir, which is incredible. I mean, I think everyone should read it, and it's like 200 pages, and you'll like I read it all in one sitting. It was amazing. And yeah, so I read the memoir and then I watched the movie again. And what was really interesting to me was that I don't know that the filmmaker really, improved on Spielman's work that much. I mean, the movie is great, but I think a huge part of what makes it so great is that Spielman's memoir is so incredibly powerful and moving, and as you say, all of these major historical events are being inflicted upon him, and it's this incredible story of survival. And so, yes, it's a great movie, but I think a huge part of its greatness comes straight from Spielman rather than the filmmaker so much. And I think the elephant in the room here is that Roman Polanski, the director of this movie, is a convicted child rapist and he's escaped justice for many years. And he couldn't accept his Academy Award for this movie because if he enters the United States, he will go to prison. Spielman, his story deserves to be told, and it's not his fault that Roman Polanski was the one to adapt his memoir. And so it was very interesting to me that I remembered the movie being good, but all the good things that I remembered came straight from the book that it was based on.
Well, I suppose at least then it's a good thing that it's a good adoption in that way. I mean, it could have been a bad adoption and then would be an even bigger shit. It's interesting that it's written by the same man that wrote Taking Sides, which was a far less well-made movie than this one. But I'm wondering now if I can kind of see similarities in the quietness of it, maybe? Like, it's got a certain docile way of telling that might be similar. I can't really put my finger on it either, but another thing that whenever we watch a movie about the Holocaust, which this is in some way, I guess, or definitely is, the way that people are unable to grasp what is happening to them continues to be so striking to me. Like, they just go along with it because that's all they know how to be. And they're like, as long as we follow the rules, as long as we work hard, we'll be fine. And we've seen it in other movies and stories too, and it just keeps giving me chills because it's so easy to think that you're gonna be fine and not being able to see the bigger picture because you simply cannot deal with that reality. And I see it around me now too in the world, and it gives me kind of bad feeling.
Yeah, well, and the Germans had a very vested interest in keeping people from knowing what was going to happen to them. I mean, several times during the memoir, Spielman talks about the Germans going out of their way to reassure them that we're not going to take any more people out of the ghetto. Like, this is it. If you're here, you're safe. Don't worry about it. And putting up these posters being like, everything's going to be fine. And just doing their best to keep people calm and thinking that, maybe the worst of it is past. So, yeah, there was certainly a lot of that going on too.
I guess it's literally in the movie too, where the Germans say, "Why would we give you food if we were going to send you away? Why would we give you this good food from the kindness of our hearts if we were planning on murdering you? You're fine." And that's right before they kill a lot more people. And
Yes.
there's a couple of scenes, and I will get to them when we get into the movie, but I want to talk about a couple for sure. It just makes me think I'm so glad that I'm alive today and not in the 40s, because I'd be useless and I would not survive.
Yeah, well, there are definitely a few very striking and horrifying scenes in the movie, and a lot of them come directly from the memoir. And you can tell Spielman wrote it right at the end of the war when the memories were still really crisp and obviously incredibly emotionally devastating to him. And you get the sense that he's still in this kind of prolonged shock because there were so many awful things in a row, and he spent so long thinking about nothing but survival. And the way I kind of described it when I was telling someone about it was like, it's like the grief is in the other room. You can hear it, but it's not on top of you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting that. There was only one scene, by the way, that made me cry in the movie. And it's not probably not the scene you would expect. I don't think you've put it in the notes because it's a tiny moment. But there's a moment in the movie where the Nazis, as they are waiting to open up the road between the ghetto and the normal people in Poland, as they say it, they are making the Jews dance, and that made me cry so much because it's so horrible and humiliating, and it's dehumanizing of people. It's just so terrible, and it just got to me. And it's fairly early on in the movie, I think.
Yeah, no, I remember the scene that you're talking about. It's like obviously we're all familiar with the vast institutionalized murder, etc. But just the little moments of watching people be treated as subhuman and watching them be humiliated on purpose is just really difficult.
Yeah. With that said, let's get into this one. We open in Warsaw in 1939. We meet musician Władysław Szpilman, also called Wladek, played by Adrian Brody, as he plays the piano on Warsaw radio. And at that moment, the Germans bomb the city. It's almost little bit funny because he just continues playing his piece because he doesn't want to stop, and he's being kind of funny with a friend of his, and it's sort of relaxed still at this point. But when he returns home, his family is packing to leave the city, but then they hear that Great Britain has declared war on the Nazis and they decide to stay.
You know what else is funny? What other movie did we watch that started with musicians playing in the middle of a bombing?
Oh my god, yeah, taking sides. That's funny,
Well,
except that time it was actually the Germans playing, so I guess maybe I don't feel as sorry for them.
yeah, this screenwriter certainly has a favorite way of starting movies. I mean, it's effective.
It sure is. And also the technician that is accompanying him as he's recording for the radio is important because we see him again later.
Yeah, this is one minor change from the book that I think is worth bringing up. In the book, the Spielman family decides that they're not going to leave Warsaw. They don't even bother packing or anything like that. When all their family and friends are leaving, they're like, this is my home. I don't know where else I would go. And at this point, we might as well hunker down here as anywhere else. And so this is kind of a running theme throughout Spielman's memoir in various places where, when they could move or when there's a possibility to move, they decide that they're going to stay put, and sometimes it's a good idea and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, it's really difficult to look at in hindsight when you know what's going to happen to these people. You're like, if only they'd moved, if only they'd gone, if only they'd done this or done that, or that sort of thing. But in the moment, it's really difficult to leave your home and leave everything behind because your home is what you know, and it's what feels safe, even though it might no longer be safe.
Yeah, definitely. Though it seems that the war will soon be over. People are very excited about the fact that Great Britain, and then France has declared war on Germany. Soon enough, the city is under German occupation, and the rights of Jewish citizens swiftly begin to be eroded. They can't sit on public benches, they're not allowed into certain establishments. Spielman meets a singer named Dorota, played by Amelia Fox, and she is quite aghast at the treatment of Polish Jews, and she will also be relevant later, so tie a little ribbon around her. And there's a bit here where they're told that they have to start wearing the star on their clothing so that they can be easily denoted as Jews in public spaces, and there's an old man walking along the street with the, star on his arm, and a couple of soldiers just turn around and just smack him right in the face, and he stumbles, and it's just such a minor act of violence compared to what's coming, but it still feels so monstrous that this old man, could be your father or your grandfather just walking along the street, and he gets just beat around the head by these young men, and nobody does anything about it.
And then he also gets told to walk in the gutter because he's no longer allowed to walk on the sidewalks.
Yeah.
It's just these small acts of dehumanizing these people. Again, it's just so gross. I do like, and I don't know how Spielman describes it in his memoir, but in the movie, when they are told they have to start wearing the Star of David, they're like, "We're not gonna brand ourselves. We're not gonna wear it. We're not gonna do it." And then the very next scene, you see them all wearing it. Like they're like very insistent they won't do it, and then the next moment they're wearing the star.
Yeah, it seems like the women in the family were a bit more practical in that regard, I guess. Him and his brother and his father certainly tried not to leave the house because every time they walked on the street, they felt very, like, conspicuous, but ultimately, I mean, you have to leave the house, right, if you have to go to work or whatever you have to do.
That's the weird thing about war. Like the world does go on at the same time. Like it's not like you can just stop living your life.
Yeah, and in Spielman's case, the interesting thing about it is that he was a sort of a well-known pianist, and so when other people in his family couldn't find work, he could usually find work. People were willing to hire him to play in their cafes or their restaurants or whatever the case was, and so he did often have to leave the house, and there were times when he was the sole breadwinner for his family.
I have no doubt. October 31, 1940. Spielman and the rest of the Warsaw Jewish population is forced to move into the Warsaw Ghetto. He supports his family, as you say, by playing the piano in a posh cafe that is a bit at odds with how most of the ghetto population live. And the rest of the ghetto is ravaged by hunger and disease, and the people in this bar are all fancy still. So I don't think his family particularly likes him playing there, but at least it's making them money so they can eat. And the Nazis kind of decide that unimaginable violence is going to be a day-to-day routine. So no one's having a good time, and Spielman witnesses a child getting murdered as he was attempting to smuggle something into the ghetto. And there's also a scene where the family watches as a man in a wheelchair gets flung from his balcony. And this, as a wheelchair user, made me shiver. I was like, oh yeah, if I'm ever gonna be in a war, I'm just gonna be fucked.
Yeah, gosh. It was a super difficult one to watch for sure. And
Yeah.
it's interesting how there's still this class strata inside the ghetto.
Hmm.
The wealthy ones are Jewish people who managed, for whatever reason, to bring their wealth over with them into the ghetto. So people who were wealthy before the war, as well as people who were willing to collaborate with the Germans. So people who were members of the Jewish police inside the ghetto, that kind of thing. And also, there was a healthy black market inside the ghetto. So it was smugglers and that kind of stuff as well, who would have been sort of the upper crust. And then there was a narrow middle class of people who were skilled but not wealthy. And then the vast majority of people who were living in the ghetto were people who survived on the kindness of others, who starved in the street. Yeah, pretty horrible. Yeah, so between March and June of 1940, the Nazis erected signage warning of typhus, and they forced the Jewish community to fund and build a wall around the quote unquote infected area. Now, the quote unquote infected area was the Jewish quarter. And in August, they announced officially that the city would be split. There would be a Polish area, a German area, and a Jewish area. And they furnished a list of streets that comprised the quote unquote Jewish district. And I have a quote here from a book called Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto by Elizabeth Hyman. And on November 16th, 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest Jewish ghetto in Poland, occupying 2.5% of the city's total area, with approximately 30% of the city's population behind its walls, was sealed, with German and Polish guards stationed outside each of its 22 gates. By 1941, the Warsaw Ghetto would have a population density of nearly 200,000 people per square mile. Its population soared to close to 500,000 as the Nazis expelled Jews from outlying cities and towns and forced them into the already overcrowded ghetto.
I have no word for this, just for the sheer numbers of this bit. How?
Yeah, it's wild. And the Germans supplied less than 10% of the food that would be required to sustain human life for that number of people. So, as such, smuggling was necessary for survival. As we see in the movie, there's people constantly flinging things over the ghetto walls, and the death rate was really high. In 1943, 10% of the ghetto's population died of hunger and disease.
You see dead people in this movie on the streets every single scene. And what got me about it most was how easily it becomes part of the scenery. Like, it's constantly Spielman having to step over a body or someone else having just passing the body and no one even looks twice at it anymore. It must have been such a common occurrence in real life as well.
Yeah, really sobering to think about how easily people adapt to just there being corpses in the gutter and not being able to do anything about it, so you just go about your day.
Yeah, you have no choice, really. But it's just, I'm really glad that I'm not able to imagine what that's like.
A friend in the Jewish resistance introduces Spielman to a guy named Majorek, played by Daniel Caltagirone, a useful acquaintance who helps Spielman to get employment certificates for his family. Majorek will also ultimately help Spielman to escape from the ghetto.
When they get these work certificates and the man stamping them is like, well, good luck, but it's not gonna help you. That was so cynical. I was like, God. And even as he says that, this work certificate is like our last little bit of hope that they will be okay.
Yeah, it's this absurd German bureaucracy thing again, where the Germans are giving people the sort of vibe that as long as you are useful and you have an employment certificate and you can prove that you're following the rules and contributing, then you'll be fine. And so people are like, yeah, if I get this employment certificate, then we won't be deported. And yeah, it just ultimately the Germans are hunting people down and rounding people up regardless of what the piece of paper that they have says.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Jewish police were known for almost being rougher on people than the actual Gestapo were because they wanted to prove that they were the 1940s pick-me's, and they were worried that if they didn't go all out and show the Germans that they were, on the team with them, then they would be deported, and so, yeah, they were not well liked in the ghetto.
Do we know what happened to the Jewish police after the whole thing?
In most cases, I mean, the Warsaw Ghetto was cleared out, right? So in most cases, they were also sent to the camps just later than everyone else.
Right. It's like, thanks for your service, but we no longer have any need of you. Bye.
Literally, you guys police yourselves, and when everyone's gone and we don't need you to police anyone, then it's your turn.
Yeah.
March 15th, 1942, Spielman and his family get a job sorting through the belongings of other Jewish Poles who have already been taken away. On August 16th, they themselves are taken to embark on the trains. Heller drags Spielman out of the line at the last moment, sparing him the fate of the rest of his family, which Spielman is initially not sure that he's grateful for, watching all your family be taken away and never seeing them again.
There's another striking thing about this scene for me because his sister and brother had not been selected to be deported on a train, and they chose to return to the family in the movie because they didn't want to be separated from them, which is another heartbreaking reality, I think, for many families that this happened to. I don't know if it's in the book, if this was real or not.
Yeah, it was his brother Henrik and his sister Helena were not chosen to be taken away, but they basically snuck out of their job and went down to the trains with everyone else.
Another thing that really shocked me from this movie, and I'm sure that it was like this in real life, is the ease and also the random way with which the Germans decided who got deported or not. It just happened. They were just like selecting people. One if you step forward, the other one step back, and that's how the selection worked. It's such a weird, like, how can you do that to human beings knowing what will happen to them? It's like, I cannot stop talking about it. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. It just makes it harder to watch people try and jump through hoops to save their own lives and knowing all the while that for the Germans it's totally arbitrary and that
Exactly. It doesn't matter whether you have a piece of paper or not. It's just a freaking lottery whether or not you will be the one to be deported today.
there's a bit right before they get on the train where they buy a piece of overpriced candy from a kid selling candy, and their father cuts the candy into 6 pieces so they can each have a little teeny tiny piece of candy, and Spielman describes that as their last meal together in his book, because after this, his family is taken away and he never sees any of them again, and that was so poignant to me. God, just watching them savor this teeny tiny little piece of candy together.
Yeah. And you just know. So even I think even if you had not known what was gonna happen to them from history, you would still know that this was gonna be the last thing they would ever do together. The writing's on the wall, these people aren't coming back. They've seen people leave and not coming back, so they must have known. It's terrible.
Yeah, you would definitely have a sense, and I remember from reading, The Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto that certainly the young Jewish people that were starting to form a core of resistance, they were getting messages from the outside of trains that would go away full of people and come back empty, and so there was certainly rumors going around in the ghetto at the very least of what would happen when they took you away.
There's another scene also at the same location where a lady has accidentally killed her baby because she was in hiding and the baby started crying and she smothered him. Is this in Spielman's book?
Yeah.
Just absolutely all the horrible things are taken from real life, I take it.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. The part that I found the most quietly devastating personally is when Spielman and his family are going towards the train and he turns to his sister and he says, "I wish I knew you better." And she says, "Thank you." And this is not something directly from the memoir, so to speak. He never got the chance to say that to his sister, but it's like a sentiment that he expressed. And so I'm just going to read this little section from the book where he's talking about his brother and one of his sisters. And about his brother, he says, "He would stare at me for a while in astonishment, then shrug his shoulders and growl, finally venting his feelings. Really, only a born fool would wear ties like Vladek's. Fool yourself. Idiot, too," I would reply, and our quarrel was in full swing. He did not appreciate the fact that I had to be well dressed when I played the piano in public. He didn't really want to understand me and my affairs. Now that he has been dead so long, I know we loved each other in our own way, in spite of everything, although we were always getting on each other's nerves, probably because we were very similar characters at heart. I understood my sister Helena the least. She was the only one who did not seem like a member of our family. She was reserved and never showed her thoughts and feelings or told us what she did when she left the house. She would come home as impassive and indifferent as ever. Day after day, she simply sat at the dining table without showing the slightest interest in what might happen. I can't say what she was really like, and now I can never find out any more about her.
God, I mean, I'm glad they put it in a movie then to give him that little piece of closure that he never got. To have that in a movie is kind of powerful. And I feel like they got the dynamics quite well between him and Henrik, too. Like, they are constantly ratting on each other and quarreling about stupid stuff.
Yeah. Very, very, very strong, accurate sibling vibes for sure. We sort of talked about this a bit offline, but I was saying I was a little surprised that they didn't have a voiceover in this movie just because the memoir is so personal. And as a viewing audience, we don't have access to Vladek's inner thoughts.
Yeah, that is interesting. Now, I will say I'm really surprised at how Adrian Brody is at, how good he is at expressing his feelings to through just his look. Like his entire body expresses how he feels.
Yeah. Hell of an actor for sure.
So Spielman is left behind. He's walking through the silent streets where there's bodies and belongings everywhere. He's very like distraught and crying and sad, but ultimately, because he has to do something in order to survive, he gets a job doing construction work outside the ghetto. At first, he hides for a while underneath the stage of his fancy cafe that's also been raided, and then he gets some work outside of the ghetto. And he gets to see
Yeah.
his friends who live outside from a distance.
The
Sorry.
part where the Nazis pull out half the detail and then get them to lay face down on the street and then shoot them in the head comes directly from Spielman's memoir, and the way he describes it is so detached. Because I guess you would have to be. It's just such senseless violence that, how do you make sense of it except to just write it down and then keep going?
Yeah, no, that's almost how they show it in the movie too. It doesn't have any consequences. Like it happens, and then life moves on, and it's terrible. And this is also I feel his last kind of familiar face that he loses in that shooting, like the man who worked with him at the cafe, and now he's on his own again. So he keeps losing people around him, and he's just utterly alone.
Yeah. Mayorik, his friend, sort of friend of a friend that he knew from the resistance, explains that the Nazis are taking the Jews away to be exterminated. And Spielman then participates in some of the preparations that are being made for what will ultimately be the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So he's going on a work detail outside of the walls. So, of course, he can smuggle, small items, hand grenades, guns, that kind of stuff back in. While he's outside the wall, he's spotted some of his old friends. So he enlists Mayorik's help to get him out of the ghetto.
Yeah, I mean, after he almost dies because he gets beat up by a Nazi after not doing his job very well. So how did this man even survive? I cannot even explain it to you. He's just extremely lucky and resilient.
Definitely. Something that we said offline was like, yeah, he was at the mercy of other people's monstrousness, but he was also often at the mercy of other people's kindness. There were a lot of people who looked the other way or brought him food or gave him somewhere to stay. It's thanks to them also that he was able to survive.
Yeah, it's a really powerful thing. That's also one of the things that gives me hope for the future. That there's always also gonna be good people looking out for others.
Yeah, definitely.
Spielman manages to escape the ghetto and reunites with his friends Jana Bogucki, played by Ruth Platt, and her husband Andre, played by Ronan Vibert. And they send him to what will be the first of many safe houses around the city. And he gets to watch the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from his window. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened between April 19 and May 16, 1943.
Yes. So I highly recommend The Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto because you will get a thorough overview of the context and what happened during the uprising. And you will also get to find out a lot about what women were up to because women were heavily involved in the uprising as well. The nuts and bolts are that on the first day of the uprising, the Jewish resistance inside the ghetto got word from compatriots on the outside that the Germans were gathering outside the ghetto walls. The resistance inside the ghetto did have links with the Polish resistance outside, and so the Polish resistance was part of how the Jewish resistance inside the ghetto were able to smuggle in weapons and that kind of stuff. So they warned people who were not fighters to retreat into these bunkers and basements that they had prepared for this purpose. And 750 fighters, both men and women, readied themselves for the Germans to enter the ghetto. I have a quote here from Zivia Lubetkin, who was one of the female resistance leaders, and she wrote that their general sense of things at the time were, "We will make it difficult for them. There will be a struggle for every building. We will fight for every house. The enemy's blood will be spilt on every threshold." Which is metal as hell. The Germans were so surprised to be shot at when they entered the ghetto that they retreated. When they came back, they brought tanks, but the Jewish fighters were highly organized. They were able to disable some of the tanks with homemade bombs. The Germans responded by lighting the ghetto on fire, which forced civilians and fighters alike into the open. However, the Germans did not feel safe in the ghetto after dark, so that provided the opportunity for the fighters to regroup. So it's just like a really wild situation because the Germans are frightened of going into the ghetto because these are Jewish guerrilla fighters, right? They're shooting them from windows. You never know. They regroup and they attack over here, and then they regroup and attack over there. They're actually a surprisingly effective fighting force, given that most of them didn't have military training and that kind of stuff. And on April 26th, the last known message reached the outside of the ghetto from the fighters within, and they said, "Today is the 8th day in which we stand in a battle for our lives. The number of our people who were slain by gunshot, of men, women, and children who burned to death is immense. Our last days are growing ever nearer. but as long as we have bullets, we will continue to fight and defend ourselves. Over the next few days, some of the fighters were able to be evacuated from the ghetto through secret tunnels, but hunger and a lack of ammunition and manpower began to take its toll on the ones who were left behind. On May 16th, the Germans blew up the Warsaw Synagogue, and that's what historians broadly consider to be the end of the uprising. But there were fighter groups left in the ghetto who put up resistance until at least the middle of June, and some of them may have lasted into October. And some 10 to 20,000 people hid out in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto until at least 1944.
So metal. I'm so sad that they didn't end up winning the uprising.
Yeah, but like, man, what an impressive show of human spirit, you know? Just
Yeah,
deciding that it would be better to, what's the old saying? Die on your feet than to live on your knees.
exactly. Like fighting instead of being sent off to death camp. There's another theme in this movie, and I'm sure it was true, that Spielman is constantly really close to danger, and that's the safest place for him. In all the safe houses that he gets to be in, it's always right on top of the Germans. And I guess they wouldn't be looking for him there, which is why it's the safest, but it gave me so much anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. And throughout his memoir, he talks about how the Germans were constantly doing a census, so to speak, because they wanted to figure out where the empty apartments were, right? So that they could go and check that nobody was hiding in them. So he's constantly like, yeah, I was in this building. And then, it became known to the authorities that there was an empty apartment. So then I had to go to a different building. And he would constantly be spending a night or two in one place and a night or two in the next place.
They don't really make that all too obvious in the movie. It feels like he stays put quite a bit longer than he would have in real life, but it makes sense, I guess.
Yanina and Andre are arrested and the safe house is burned, but Spielman elects not to leave. Again, this is part of the, I guess, through line of the book that I was talking about earlier, where in any situation where the idea of leaving just for leaving's sake doesn't appeal, the Spielman family elects to stay where they are. And so he just stays. He's ready to throw himself out the window rather than give himself up to the Nazis, but for a little while at least, he gets a reprieve and nobody comes for him. But ultimately, he has no choice but to flee when he accidentally makes a loud noise. He knocks a bunch of plates down, and that draws his attention to his presence in this apartment that is supposed to be empty. And when he goes to the emergency address he was given, it turns out to be the flat of the singer Dorota, who he was kind of sweet on at the beginning of the war before all of this happened.
Yes, the fleeing actually made me laugh too because I say made me laugh, it didn't make me laugh, but there's something funny about it because he's looking out the window, thinking about jumping, and then there's another explosion and the wall to the other apartment next to him gets blown out. And it's like, it's this current again where he cannot get off it and he just has to flee, like he has no choice. It's so effective to watch a movie where stuff just happens to a person that they manage to keep it going so well. It's really well made in terms of pacing. I really like Dorota. I really adore this woman.
Yeah, she is not a real person. I guess you could say she's representative of a lot of his pre-war acquaintances who were willing to lend a hand at great personal risk.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense for the story's sake to pick her as a character, also to connect the before and the during together, and I think that's really quite effective.
I also think that when he meets her and she's married in a nice little house and she's pregnant, she is living this life that could have been his. If the war hadn't happened, then he might have been living there with her and, about to have a family and that kind of stuff. And so I think like getting to see that life has gone on in a more or less normal way. And meanwhile, he's a leaf on the stream of survival.
Yes, definitely. And he's so sweet about it too, because you can tell that he's at first he's like looking at her, kind of disappointed, but then he's just really sweet to his friend, this woman that he knew before the war. I am really glad though that she asks him to come inside. Like she doesn't turn him away. She could have, but she, Dorota, and her husband Michael, played by Valentin Tarka, set Spillman up in a new safe house, and the man designated to look after him and send him food is actually the technician from the very first scene, but he ends up ripping everyone off and raising money to buy him food, but then taking all the money and leaving him without any food. So he's on his way to dying, but fortunately, Dorota comes to say goodbye to him before they leave town for somewhere safer. And she is able to bring him food and get him a doctor who checks him out.
Yeah, this comes from the memoir. This man started out bringing him food every couple weeks, but then the spans of time got longer and longer and longer. At one point, he had no choice. He had to leave the apartment, go to the shop at the end of the street, and buy a loaf of bread, and just pray to God that nobody looked at his face and wonder if he was Jewish or not.
Oh my god. I haven't looked up a picture of the real Spillman. Did he look Jewish? Some people just do. You just know that they're Jewish.
Yeah, I guess. But I mean, he didn't get caught, but it was obviously you definitely feel very conspicuous as one of the few Jewish people left in Warsaw at this point.
I bet the person designated to look after him in real life was not the same man that met him at his recording for the radio in the beginning of the movie.
Can't
Just
remember if he already knew him or not.
probably not. I feel like you would have known if he did. Like it would be pretty like imagine knowing someone from before and then being betrayed by him.
August 1st, 1944, Spielman watches the Warsaw Uprising from his window when his building is targeted by German return fire because a bunch of the Warsaw resistance fighters are elsewhere in his building. He must flee once more, and then he spends a long period of time as a barely surviving denizen of the ruins of Warsaw. I have a quote from Agent Zoe by Claire Mully, and we interviewed Claire Mully, so if you're interested in the Warsaw Uprising, then definitely go listen to that episode. But she says, over a million Poles were living in Warsaw at the start of August 1944. Some 40,000 to 50,000 were soldiers sworn into the Home Army, and the Home Army is what they called the Polish resistance. Of these, 10% were women. So the resistance at this point, they wanted to drive the Germans back and establish a center of government before the Soviets arrived because they feared, and rightly, given what ultimately happened, that if the Soviets were able to take credit for quote unquote freeing Warsaw or freeing Poland, then they would be able to set up a government. And at this point, there's a Polish government in exile in London. And ideally, what most people want is for the Polish government to come back. And they know that if the Soviets liberate them, they might have, this a Soviet government to contend with. And so like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of the previous year, initially the resistance were successful in their attacks on German units. It seems that Germans everywhere were not prepared for resistance by civilians, and Hitler was very furious about this. He demanded that the city itself be leveled. So the Germans initiated a house to house hunt. They made no distinction between civilians and fighters. They killed old people, they killed children, anybody that they found. 40,000 Polish people were murdered in one day. The Soviets paused their advance to let the Germans and Poles slug it out effectively because the Soviets, it could only benefit them if the backbone of Polish resistance was broken before they moved in because they were like, we already know those guys will fight us and we don't want that. And so the Polish resistance, they could see the Soviets. Like if you went up and stood on the roof of a building, they could see the Soviet army on a hill and the Soviets were simply not helping them. So this was a huge part of the reason why the resistance ultimately failed in their goal of driving the Germans out. But for a little while at least, they did manage to take a chunk out of the Nazis. The Home Army took control of the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, and they actually liberated 350 Jews who had been brought in to clear the ruins from Auschwitz. The Germans bombarded the hell out of the city. They deliberately targeted the historic Old Town. They were trying to destroy historic monuments and cultural landmarks and that kind of stuff. The resistance took to the sewers. They had this underground tunnel system where they would be able to move around right under the Germans' noses. Unfortunately, over time, they started running out of food and ammunition, and they had sustained staggering losses. So on October 2nd, the Home Army had to capitulate to the Germans. Now, luckily, under the Geneva Convention, they were considered enemy combatants. A lot of them were sent to POW camps rather than being executed outright. The civilian population was expelled from the city to allow for the Germans to destroy it. And when the Soviets took control of the ruined city in January of 1945, 85% of the buildings had been destroyed. And again, the Germans deliberately targeted cultural and historic landmarks. They were trying to destroy Polish culture because fascists are the enemy of art and culture. But the uprising was the largest military effort undertaken by any European resistance movement during World War II, and it cost the Germans roughly 16,000 soldiers, so not nothing.
Not nothing, but also not enough.
Yeah, but when you think about it, right, they'd been occupied, so difficult to smuggle supplies into the city. Some of these people are military, but a lot of them are not.
Yeah, I feel like the Poles in general are between a rock and a hard place with the Germans on one side and the Soviets on the other. Like, there's nowhere for them to go, and it's just horrible.
Yeah, and the context of this is at the beginning of the war, the Germans and the Soviets signed a pact saying, we're just going to split Poland in half. No, we're not going to ask the Poles about this.
Mm.
Famously, the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany is what triggered the start of World War II. Until the Germans broke the non aggression pact with the Soviets in 1941, they were perfectly happy to just split Poland down the middle. And after the war, for decades, there was a communist Soviet puppet government in Poland.
Yeah, the war didn't end for the Poles at all. Like, we always celebrate the end of World War II in Europe, but I think the Poles don't see it that way.
One of the interesting things about this memoir by Spielman is that, yes, it was published in 1946, but then it was heavily censored because the Soviets did not want any resistance to be cast in a positive light. They wanted people to believe that the Polish resistance had collaborated with the Nazis. They did not want these people to get any credit because they were worried that this would help to foment a resistance against the Soviet regime. And so this memoir was censored, and it wasn't until 1999, I believe, that it got an English translation and, and it became rather well known outside of Poland.
Agent Zoe, the book that you quoted from earlier by Claire Mully, also spends a big portion of the book talking about living life in Poland under the Soviet oppression that followed. So I would definitely recommend the book as well if you want to learn some more about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Spielman is caught one day by German Captain Wilhelm Hausenfeld, played by Thomas Kretschmann. Instead of turning him in, Hausenfeld asks him to play a piece on the piano. He seems kind of moved by this, so he begins to provide Spielman with food and blankets during the last few weeks before the Soviets get there. Spillman is up in some attic and it's not. He doesn't have a lot of space, but at least he survives by the food that this captain gives him. And when this man's unit must retreat ahead of the Soviet advance, Heisenfeld asks deliberately for Spillman's name before he leaves. And he then says, Spillman is a very funny name for a pianist.
I think you said it's an accurate name for a pianist, or it's a fitting name for
Yeah,
a pianist. Yeah.
yeah, it's a fitting name. And it is. It is a really fitting name for a pianist.
Yeah.
I have some feelings about this man. I'm constantly conflicted between, for Spillman, I'm really glad that this man was there and was able to keep him alive. But at the same time, it's one of those cases where clearly this man has seen the writing on the wall and he's like, what if I help a good Jew? So I can then say later that I helped a Jew. Mixed feelings.
Yeah. I think it's interesting in this in the English translation that they put out in 1999, they put out some excerpts from Hosenfeld's wartime diary. So we know in his words how he felt. This is during the Warsaw Uprising in August of 1944. He writes, the Fuhrer is to issue a decree that Warsaw is to be razed to the ground. A start has been made already. All the streets liberated in the uprising are destroyed by fire. The inhabitants have to leave the city and are going westward in crowds of many thousands. If the news of this decree is true, then it's clear to me that we have lost Warsaw and with it Poland and the war itself. We are giving up a place we held for 5 years, extending it and telling the world it was a forfeit of war. Monstrous methods were used here. We acted as if we were the masters and would never go away. Now we can't help seeing that all is lost. We're destroying our own work, everything of which the civil administration was so proud. It saw its great cultural tasks as being here and wanted to prove their necessity to the world. Our policy in the East is bankrupt, and we are erecting a final memorial to it with the destruction of Warsaw. So this guy was very much he was a bureaucrat, first of all. He was a postmaster maybe. He did something that was more of a clerical sort of office job rather than
Mm.
being a frontline soldier. But you can tell throughout these excerpts from his memoir, he's just really anguished about what the Nazi government is doing and the stuff that's being done in his name, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting though how from that excerpt, at least, he doesn't exclude himself from it. He does still say we, and he doesn't say they. It's not like he. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, I think if this were not based on a true story, you would definitely be a little suspicious of this character appearing out of nowhere as, like, a sort of white savior type, but, I mean, no, this really did happen, this was really and as someone who appeared in Spielman's life at a time where he was, drinking filthy water that he was finding in bathtubs, and, he would go days at a without food. So at a time in his life when he really needed it, this person turned up and did the right thing.
Like when he gives him bread with like a packet of jam and it looks so luxurious before he leaves. And I'm like, thank God, give this man some real food.
Yeah, right? Anywhere from a few hundred to 2,000 Polish people, including Polish Jews, hid out in the ruins of Warsaw during its destruction between November of 1944 and January of 1945. So this little chunk of time is between effectively the Polish Home Army, capitulating to the Germans and the Soviets taking over the city. So this span of time where the Germans are destroying everything. They called these people the Robinson Crusoes of Warsaw, and they lived in the remains of houses and bunkers, foraging for food the way we see in the movie. They included a small group of Warsaw Ghetto fighters who had survived, and the German commander of the Ninth Army, anyway, one of the groups that was in the city at the time, issued an execution order for anyone found hiding in the ruin. So, super dangerous existence.
Yeah. Like how much food would there even still be? Like not much, I'm thinking.
No, there's nothing to eat. Obviously, it's Poland in the winter, so it's very, very cold.
Yeah. It's cold.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult existence.
Yeah. Like the German captain giving Spielman his heavy coat just gave me all the feelings.
Yeah. The Soviet army arrives. Spielman has a narrow miss when he goes out in Hosenfeld's big coat and is mistaken for a German. And this is straight from the memoir. He ends up having to run back inside a building and they're shooting at him and he's like, I'm not German, I'm Polish, I'm Polish. So that they realize that of course that he's not German. He hasn't shaved in weeks. He's extremely underweight. He does not look like a German soldier. He looks like a guy who's been hiding in the ruins. And so he gets taken in by the Soviets and he gets some food and then some help. And weeks go by. A friend of Spielman's is on his way home from a concentration camp when he passes a little temporary Soviet prisoner of war camp that's holding all these German POWs. And of course, as you can imagine, these Jewish people who are coming back from the concentration camp are just heaping abuse on these German soldiers. Hosenfeld is there and he reaches out to this friend of Spielman and he's like, I helped this guy named Spielman. If you know him, can you tell him that I'm here? And so this friend relays the message to Spielman that Hosenfeld is alive and needs help. And Spielman attempts to find him, but when he gets there, the camp is gone and he doesn't know Hosenfeld's name, right? And so he can't even attempt to track him down.
Yeah. Again, I had mixed feelings about this, but knowing that this was real and that this man seemed to be at least. I think in the movie you don't quite know what his job is, and you don't quite know what he's done for the rest of the war. You see what he does when he's there, which is not a lot. But at the same time, you're like, wait, do we trust this man? And I am kind of sad that he didn't find him, because at least then it would have been up to him to decide to give this man mercy or not. And now he just couldn't find him.
Yeah, and the Spielman family connected with the Hosenfeld family, years and years later, and found out that wherever he went, Hosenfeld was rescuing Jews wherever he could. So, one point there was transport of Jewish people that were being taken away, and he made the transport stop, and he was like, "I need that guy," and he was, like, able to pull a guy off the thing, and, like, wherever there was an opportunity for him to try and help people, he would do it, and so, yes, he was a cog in this system, and he was ultimately helping the Germans to win the war, but he
Yeah.
obviously had this great personal sense of morality that if he saw something personally in front of him that was wrong, he would try and correct it. And so he wasn't simply helping Spielman, for example, so that someone would put a good word in for him after the war, which we have seen in other pieces of media, right? That was a thing that, many Germans seeing the writing on the wall decided that they were going to try and do something good so that someone would speak up for them. But
Mhm.
that doesn't seem to be what was happening in this case. This seems to be part of a pattern of behavior for Hosenfeld.
Well, thank God. That helps. Like, I'm glad. Because you end up being so cynical too, right? You're like, you've seen this once. And then you're like, wait. Is he being for real, or is he just trying to save his own skin? But apparently it just wasn't trying to save his own skin
Yeah.
until the end, which is fair. Like, everyone would do whatever they can to try and survive.
There's just something about Hosenfeld appearing when Spielman was at this absolute low point where survival was day to day and he might not make it, and he's living like an animal, and he plays the piano for Hosenfeld, and they connect on this human level through art in a way that Spielman hasn't really been able to connect with that side of himself since the beginning of the war, and then Hosenfeld disappears again. He's almost like an apparition that comes into Spielman's life when he needs him, and then he's gone when Spielman doesn't need him anymore. And I don't really know what I wanna say about that, but I just like an interesting thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting way for us to reconnect with Spielman as a pianist. We've kind of lost that side of him when he got to the ghetto. He no longer got to be that person, and we get to reconnect with him in that way. And that's also how the movie ends, because it ends with him playing the piano once again in a large concert hall. And there's an end card that says Władysław Szpilman continued to live in Warsaw until his death on July 6th in the year 2000. He was 88 years old, so he lived to good old age. The name of the German officer was Captain Wilhelm Hausenfeld, as we already know at this point. All that is known is that he died in a Soviet prisoner of war camp in 1952, so he was stuck there for a long time before he died.
Yeah, and we don't even know if that's true. That's just what the Soviets said when Spielman and Hosenfeld's family tried to track him down. They were like, "Oh yeah, he died in 1952." He could have died
Uh,
right at the end of the war. Like, we really don't that information is not really
no,
verifiable.
no, that makes sense. The Soviets they didn't usually divulge much information about the crimes that they committed.
Yeah, for sure.
How long is this movie? It's fairly long, right?
It's, like, almost 3 hours, I think?
It didn't feel that long to me. Like, I was just completely enthralled by it. I didn't look at my phone once.
Yeah, it's definitely it absorbs your attention, for sure.
I almost wish that we gotten a partial end card about the rest of his family, Spillman's family. Like, we know they died, it's implied, but I would have liked to have seen it in writing, maybe, just to honor their memory a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair. I think, obviously, when the memoir was written, it was still really fresh. Like, he doesn't really discuss it that they're dead other than the fact that, like, the from the excerpt I read, he references the fact that he knows they're dead, but he doesn't
Yeah.
reference the specific circumstances or anything like that.
How does the memoir end? For reference, Sam is looking at the book.
Though he survives, the memoir doesn't necessarily have what I would call a quote unquote happy ending. He just talks about after a couple of weeks, he was able to walk through the streets of Warsaw as a free man, but the city, as we discussed, was pretty much razed to the ground, obviously significantly damaged by the war. There's still bodies laying around, there's still so much evidence of all the horrible things that have gone on here. And yeah, and so he says, "Tomorrow I must begin a new life. How could I do it with nothing but death behind me? What vital energy could I draw from death?" I went on my way. A stormy wind rattled the scrap iron in the ruins, whistling and howling through the charred cavities of the windows. Twilight came on. Snow fell from the darkening, leaden sky.
That's kinda pretty, as devastating as it is.
Yeah,
How do you move on from years like that? I don't think you can.
yeah. There's also a postscript where he talks about how he looked for Hosenfeld and didn't find him. And then he says, I sometimes give recitals in the building at number 8 Narbut Street in Warsaw, where I carried bricks and lime, where the Jewish brigade worked, the men who were shot once the flats for German officers were finished. The officers did not enjoy their fine new homes for long. The building still stands, and there is a school in it now. I play to Polish children who do not know how much human suffering and mortal fear once passed through their sunny schoolrooms. I pray they may never learn what such fear and suffering are.
That's very powerful. He's a fairly good writer, too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Conveys so much in such spare, concise language, you know?
I will have to pick up the book, especially if it's, as you said, it's quite short. So I think I should pick it up and read it.
Yeah.
So with the end of the movie, all that's left to do for us is rate it. But before we do, I have a couple things for you to listen to first. We have merch, so if you ever wanted to wear the Rosie logo on your body or on anything else, literally anything, you can go get some merch. I'll put a link on our website by the time this episode airs, so you can go get it and send it to us, please.
And you should do it because that's what all the cool kids are doing.
Exactly. Like, imagine, have you seen our logo? It's so neat. Anyway, another thing you can do is follow us wherever you get your podcast. And you can also send this episode to a friend because you just should. Like, this is a good movie, and talking about this movie is fun and interesting and important, and you get lots of historical details. So, send this episode to a friend. And now I guess we should rate it.
How many cans full of cucumbers out of 10 would you rate this movie?
Oh man, I think I would rate it 9 cans full of cucumbers out of 10 because it really moved me. Didn't cry a lot, but it was a really good watch. The acting was great. The way it was told through Spillman's eyes was really effective. It's just good. I don't have a whole lot of specific things to say about it, honestly, but I just enjoyed my watching experience quite a bit. How about you?
Yeah. Profoundly moving, obviously drawing on extremely powerful source material. I don't have tons to say that I haven't already said. But there was a reason why I used to show it to kids when I was teaching about the Holocaust, right? It's just here's what happened, here it is. And it's not embroidered and it's not, it's just this is what happened to this one guy, and here's the window through which he saw the world for these 6 years. And, a guy who was symbolic of everything the Nazis were trying to destroy, not just as a Jewish man, but also as a Polish man, also as a musician. So I just think that yeah, I think everyone should check it out. It's a good movie. And if you draw the line at supporting Roman Polanski's work, I fully think that's valid. And in that case, pick up a copy of the memoir because it is quite good, and you won't regret it.
So, how many cans of cucumbers?
I will rate this movie 8 cans of cucumbers out of 10.
Okay, thank you. That concludes the rating. Are you reading anything interesting?
I am. I am reading The Thin Red Line by James Jones. Obviously, The Thin Red Line is quite well known, and actually, I think the movie also has Adrian Brody in it. But he also wrote From Here to Eternity, which they also made a movie of. So perhaps we will cover this one, and perhaps we will cover that one at some point.
And perhaps we will. I'm still reading the same book, but I'm so far into it. You'd be so proud of me. But I will stop yapping about the book now. And we've been talking for quite a while, so I'll wrap it up. Thank you everyone for listening. You can follow us wherever you get your podcast and rate us 5 stars. If you rated us yet, it's really fun if you do. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or you can visit our website, rosiethereviewer.com, for more information. And we will see you next week.
Bye bye.